So about a month and a half ago, I failed a pretty big hike. And so in this episode, I just kind of want to tell you the story of what happened and then the lessons that I learned so that it doesn't happen to you when you do your hikes this summer. Real quick overview of what the hike was. So what I was doing was a 14,000 foot peak in Colorado called Snowmass. Now, this is a very remote elk range 14er. And when I mean remote, it is a very long approach. And so essentially it's about 11 and some change for miles and bringing the total amount of the hike to 22 and a half miles with 6,000 feet of vertical, above, at 14,000 feet too. So yeah, it's known for this big alpine lake. It's super beautiful that a lot of people will camp at. There's a huge snowfield that is before the actual summit. And that's why it's called Snowmass, because there's just a giant snowmass that kind of stays for many months out of the year on the, before you get to the summit. From there, you get up above the snowmass. And so it's requiring crampons, ice axe, helmet, all that type of stuff. After you get to the snowmass, then you get to this ridge scramble to get over to the summit, class 3, maybe a class 4 move in there as well. So it's not while it's not extremely technical, like class 5 technical, it is class 3, maybe class 4, and it is definitely committing, especially when you're doing it in the early season. So what my plan was first off with this hike was I thought I was going to be smart. I thought I was going to beat the crowds, and I thought that I was going to, avoid storms. And all the trip reports for this in prior years were saying you got to do it during the snow. So, what I thought that meant was you got to do it right after basically winter, like spring, not early summer, but in the spring. So my idea was to do a 2-day hike in. So essentially it was going to be hike in the afternoon of one day, camp at the lake, and then I was going to wake up super early to summit in the morning because being there at the lake was going to result in it was only 2 miles. It was literally like only 2 miles from the lake with 3,000 vertical. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is when you're constantly switching crampons out, grabbing your ice axe, you're on snow, you're in the dark, you can't really navigate, and you're at altitude. So anyway, what happened was I felt super strong. I had a good taper leading up into this. Weather looked great, and my plan was very solid on paper. Now, what had actually happened, though, was I started and I actually was carrying a huge kit. I was carrying crampons, a helmet, an ice axe, and snowshoes. And so the first few miles of this hike, well, really the first 7 miles of this hike, because it was about 8.5 to the lake where I was eventually going to camp, I was like, why am I even bringing snowshoes? Like there were some intermittent snowfields and things, but it wasn't anything that you'd need to throw full-on snowshoes for. And so I almost thought about ditching these things. Well, then what happened was I literally turned a switchback corner and I got into this shaded forest about 1.5 miles before the lake, and it was just pure snow. So I was certainly glad that I brought my snowshoes. Now, I saw there had to be a group in front of me, and they were just post-holing everywhere. And even I was kind of post-holing a little bit even in my snowshoes. Eventually, I caught up to this group that was in front of me that said that they left 3 hours before me. And they got to that, they had basically been in that 1.5 mile spot for basically hours because they were just post-holing constantly. So just burning all this energy. And frankly, I was burning a lot of energy too, even just because I had this heavy pack on. I was intermittently post-holing, but eventually I passed them anyway and ended up camping at the lake. Now, when I got to the lake, I looked up and I was like, wow, there's a lot more snow on this snowmass than I thought. And the gully looked extremely steep. But one thing that I've learned, and one thing that will be the theme for this actual podcast, is that you really don't know how steep things are until you actually get on them. And I'll tell a story about that later. But, well, I'll tell it right now. So the first time I learned this lesson was we were on the Alpine Lakes high route. in Washington, and we went around this spot, and we were like about to kind of finish this hike. We wanted to go up this gully though to go summit some kind of mountain. And we looked at the gully and we were like, dude, that is so steep. There's no way anybody can get up that. Well, then a week later we ran into somebody, or I don't know what happened, but essentially I figured out that people do that all the time. And it just looked way worse to us, maybe because of the mental state we were in, but also just because it just looked treacherous. And so you really don't know how treacherous or steep a slope is until you are actually on that thing. Maybe it's more than you think, but I have found probably 8 out of 10 times it is a lot easier and a lot less treacherous than I actually thought. Anyway, so that's what happened with Snowmass on this first instance, was that gully looked super steep, and I went to bed that night thinking, man, I don't even know. I'm going to go until it doesn't make sense anymore. I think that's a really good option for folks that are 50-50 on something, is go until it doesn't make sense anymore. So we woke up at 2. I think we were gone by 3, something like that. And we went up that steep gully, and it was steep, but it was great. It was actually really fun to climb up. And then eventually we were on the Snowmass. So we're on the Snowmass, and I was with 2 folks that, or at least one folk that I met at the lake that didn't have a lot of good snow experience. She was also getting quite altitude sick. And I think that was playing a little bit into my mental psyche, because all of this is like, I mean, everything kind of has to go real perfect for, I wouldn't say that. Everything doesn't have to go perfect for a summit, but I guess it's a culmination of things. I think it's the cheese grater concept. Like when enough of the holes line up, then you can, stuff starts to slip through. And I think things were starting to line up. Waking up super early, you don't have a lot of sleep. You're with people that don't have as much experience. One's getting altitude sick, blah, blah, blah. And they were very hesitant about going up that gully. Eventually they got up there, but they didn't really like it that much. Anyway, so then there was another steep pitch before you get to the ridge proper. And again, I thought it was really fun. It was great in crampons and all that type of stuff. But again, they were a little bit sketched out. So then we pop up to the ridge, and now we are 0.2 miles away from the summit and 400 feet of vertical. But when I pop across that ridge, it's just covered in snow. And I know from the beta, what it said, at least on 14ers.com, was that there's a lot of loose rock on this particular ridge. And so when I looked at it, obviously on the east side of the ridge, the snow was thick. You're using crampons, and your ice axe is going to stick if you fall. On the opposite side, the west side of the ridge, though, there was just a couple inches of snow, basically just hard packed ice snow, just a couple inches where you're, not enough for your crampons to stick in and not enough for your ice axe to stick in if you were to slide. And I looked at the consequences of a slide, and the consequences of a slide were death. So I assessed it as, I don't think this is good. When the other 2 people in the party got to the ridge, they basically immediately said there's no way that they're going to do it. And so I think that also played into my mental psyche as well. So I ended up calling it at 0.2 miles and 400 feet of vert from the top. Now, I had already gone 11 miles, almost 6,000 feet of vertical. It took me 15 hours to get to that point there, hiking with a backpack on and doing everything I did. And when I tell you that was heartbreaking, I have never been in that situation before where I have been that close to a summit that I've called it ever. So how can I make sure that this doesn't, so how can we as hikers make sure something like this doesn't happen again? Well, and what were the lessons that I learned? So number one, I think it's really good to know that you have that skill. So in other words, it's good. There's bold mountaineers and there's old mountaineers, but there's usually not old, bold mountaineers. And so what that means is that simply if you are always going for broke, you might not be there for a long time. In other words, you might pass away in the mountains. Now, to get old, it means that you have the mental capacities and the abilities in order to make calls like that. And so I think I was super proud of myself to be able to do that, even though I spent so much time. Now that was that was 15 hours up. It was like 10 hours down. Mind you, it was a 4-hour and 45-minute drive there. So 9 hours of drive. I mean, there was a lot that went into this, a lot of packing, but I called it. Now, but what I learned from that is a couple things. Number one, there was no beta really on this mountain for about a month prior to us going there in April. In April is when the last trip report was. And what I learned is that I am kind of done being the guinea pig of trip reports. And I'm going to wait now until I get trip reports or I read trip reports from other people that if they want to be the guinea pig, that's totally cool. And that probably sounds kind of like being an a-hole, but I'm not going to waste all my time, especially when I'm driving frickin' 5 hours to this place and I have such, and it's such a big commitment to me. I'm going to wait for that. Number two, I'm kind of done with early spring or spring 14ers in general, just because there's a lot more variables that can go into early spring hikes. As a lot of people know, there's obviously lingering snow. There's not a lot of beta. There's a lot of trees down. One thing with us is there was no footprints. Typically, you'll be on a 14er like this, and typically there's footprints going one direction or another direction. I mean, that's not something that you should rely on, but it does help a lot. If that was the case, and I think now sometimes this does work. I mean, I did the whole Timberline Trail in snow one time because it was early July, and I was actually the guinea pig that wrote a trip report. So it is actually pretty fun to do if you're the first one in there. But, just know what you're getting yourself into if you don't have those trip reports. Let's see what else here. So yes, sometimes things look more steep and treacherous than they are. I evaluated that ridge as being something that I wasn't comfortable in doing. We'll talk about what I kind of found out about that ridge when I went back there a month and a half later. I think the other thing is that you have to be aware of the people in your party. So while I was not actually with these people, and they were really good folks, I do think some of their mentality rubbed off on me with the underconfidence and being very hesitant to do some of the things on the mountain. I know that if I would have been with my main climbing buddies, we would have sent it. And probably what we would have done is, instead of taking the standard route, we probably would have took what was called a ridge direct route, which was a steeper route, but it would have cut off a lot of that scrambling on the summit to get us closer to the summit in the end. And so I think you need to be aware of the people that you're with and the mentality that they have with things. Sometimes this can go the opposite direction too, where it's too risky. I've been with that same climbing partner before, and I get into really risky things that I'm not comfortable with. So you have to have a balance there. So the other thing that I figured out is that, so I posted a video about me failing this, basically where I was at on Instagram, and with the summit behind me and talking about it, blah blah blah. And man, there was so many comments. One, there was a lot of support for it. Two, there was a lot of people, of course, calling me a wuss for not doing it. Armchair Monday quarterbacks, which, doesn't really bother me. But what kind of surprised me was that there was a lot of comments just saying, "Hey, I would have just counted that and went home, and never went up there again." And for somebody like me, that is just it doesn't compute. And I think that you can base your life on that simple principle of actually doing what you said you did. I remember, for example, there was a time where I ran a marathon in the mountains. I was training for a 50-mile race. This is in Oregon. And I remember that I got back home. I did 26.1 miles. It wasn't until I got all the way home, an hour home, that I got out of the car and I was like, you got to be kidding me. A marathon's 26.2 miles? So I literally had my Crocs on and I did another 1/10 of a mile just running around in a circle in the driveway. I mean, that's how crazy I am about finishing things properly. So when I see these comments about saying, and I know they're coming from a helpful place, but they didn't sit right with me. So what did I do? So I decided to return a month and a half later. Now, this would have been last weekend. So I decided to return a 4-hour, 45-minute drive back. I'm going to redo the whole thing, 22 and a half miles and $6,000 a vert. So this time I came back with a better mindset, number one, and also a better strategy in my mind. So one, the snow to the lake was melted. And a lot of the snow sans the snowmass was also melted. So what I decided to do is I'm going to go super light. I'm going to go do it in one day. I'm not going to carry crampons. I'll carry an ice axe and helmet, but I'm not going to carry crampons. I'm not going to carry snowshoes. So I'm already deducting a lot of weight there. I'm also deducting my overnight gear. And so basically with this push, I woke up at 1 a.m. I was solo, or not woke up at 1 a.m. I started at 1 a.m. I was solo and I crushed it up to the lake, got up to the snowmass, and I got to that same ridge that I quit at. Filmed another video talking about kind of what I am right now, and then scrambled that ridge. And now in scrambling that ridge, it wasn't kind of like the gully that I talked about earlier. It kind of wasn't as treacherous as I thought. Now, this was because I also made a better call in the time that I went. There was not snow in these gullies that you go over in no fall zone. But looking back on it, I almost think that maybe I could have sent it a lot easier if I would have known that about the ridge, and if I would have just maybe tested it a little bit more. Going back to one of the things that I talked about, one of the principles that I have, which is go until it doesn't make sense anymore. When I was on that ridge before, and this was really good too, because when we woke up on that overnighter, the go until it doesn't make any sense anymore was playing in my head the whole time, because there was no overnight freeze. And so they were we kind of didn't know if we were going to post hole the whole way up to the ridge. And if that was the case, might as well call it right away. But again, we're doing some post holing, but eventually, I mean, you keep going and you're gathering more and more data. And it proved to me that, we had the variables right in our favor in order to make it to the top. But it wasn't until it started to not make sense when I got to the top and then I saw that snow there. And I did try to scramble that ridge a little bit, and it was weird. It was like, should I wear crampons? Should I not wear crampons? You were kind of between this whole thing. And so to me, it didn't make sense anymore. On this time around, it made obviously total sense. There was nothing that popped up that didn't make sense, essentially. So anyway, I got to the summit and I hung out there for a while, went back down, and I mean, it was a great time. I'm glad that I went back and redid this whole thing, because I gained more experience. I was able to push myself again, did a long day in the mountains, was training for Gannett. All these things happened and I also got closure on this mountain, because it did bother me for like the whole month and a half that I couldn't check that one off the list. So, failing that hike really sucked, but it taught me a lot, and it also solidified a lot of principles with me. Number one being that I am not somebody that sacrifices their integrity, especially being somebody kind of more in the public eye too. If I say that I did something, I did it. You could trust that. I will never say something that I didn't do. Also, it reinvigorated the principle of go until it doesn't make sense anymore. And then, the mentality of making sure that you have the correct mentality in the party that you have. For example, we're going to be doing Gannett Peak here in the next week. And I kind of assembled an A team for this, because I want competent, positive partners. And so one of them is a mountain guide that I know. One of them is a national triathlete that holds 2 Guinness World Book of Records and is a huge business owner and just super successful in every aspect of his life. The other one is Ozzy, my main climbing partner, who's just an absolute savage, whoops my butt on the mountains. And all these guys, including me, I mean, I'll probably be the weak link here, which is great. But the fact that I have these basically killers with me is going to, I think, increase the odds that I get to the summit. So make sure that you know the mentality of the people in the party. But yeah, I mean, this failure taught me a lot. So failure, isn't final for you guys, right? So it's feedback. And they always say you learn more from your failures than your successes. And that's just because you learn more from pain than you do from success. So this one hit me in the mouth, but I'm glad I get to talk about it on this podcast and kind of give you maybe some lessons that I learned. So when you do a future mountain, it won't happen to you. So, if this hit home, please share this with somebody that would enjoy it. And please leave a 5-star rating on Spotify. I would appreciate that. Thank you guys. We'll catch you next time.